the title of our talk today is How Flexible or Tolerant is Too Flexible or Tolerant. It's joint work with Lorena Ramírez-Ludeña, who is a professor at the law school at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And those terms, flexible and tolerant, are terms that we apply to characterize semantic phenomena, or at the very least, phenomena that have to do with the use of language. So they are technical terms for us. And I will later on talk a little bit more about what we mean by them. Now, a different title for our talk could have been The Perils of Engineering. Because, you know, engineering, whether it is conceptual or physical, it's a wonderful thing. It produces major works that most of the time improve the lives of humans. But sometimes when things get a little too stretched, things may go wrong, as we have recently seen. In the second part of our talk, we will talk about one of these perils, not for the Suez Canal, but for conceptual engineering, something that may be something a little more than problematic, something to watch out for in conceptual engineering. So the plan of the talk is the following. We have two parts here. First of all, it's some background work, and I will present two orthogonal semantic distinctions: flexibility, what we call flexibility, and what we call tolerance. And we will talk about their connection or lack of connection to conceptual engineering. Here, I must confess that as regards their connection to conceptual engineering, mostly what we have are questions and queries, trying to figure out exactly in which way these distinctions that we have made connect or fail to connect with conceptual engineering. In the second part of the talk, we will examine a particular case. We will bring the discussion on tolerance and flexibility and their connection to engineering to the study of one particular case that has legal implications, and also we think some practical social and political consequences. So the first part, as I say, is this distinction between flexibility and inflexibility on one hand, and tolerance and strictness on the other hand. This distinction appeared already, and this is based on previous work by Lorena and myself: tolerance, flexibility, and the application of kind terms. This is supposed to come out at some point or other. We don't know when in Synthes. It has been online since 2018. But anyway, so let's discuss a little bit these issues. Flexibility has to do with whether some changes in the domain of application of a term are taken to be possible while preserving meaning, or at the very least consistency with past usage. So obviously what we're talking about when we're talking about flexibility is not a case like presently, where everybody agrees that there has been a change in meaning. Presently, before the 15th century, meant one thing, and afterwards it means another thing. Now, issues about when there is a break in use, when there is a change of meaning, those are very difficult issues, and there's lots of gray areas here. But clearly the case of presently is one case in which everybody agrees that it doesn't mean nowadays what it used to mean. So that's one. We're not talking about that when we're talking about flexibility. We're not talking either about the changes of extension that can happen, for instance, with a term like endangered, or for endangered species. This is in fact an example that John Perry uses. You have certain species that are under the extension of endangered. Then for whatever reason, these species start flourishing. Then you take them out of the extension of endangered. That's not a question of flexibility, among other things, because there's a change. The criteria are exactly the same. And it's expected that there are going to be these cases of changes in the extension. Perhaps the clearest illustration of what we mean by flexibility is a fictional case, is the Avi case, which appears, it appeared many, many years ago in 1982 in a paper by Mark Wilson, Predicate Meets Property, which is in Field Review. And the story that we tell is the story that Mark Wilson tells as Henry Jackman in another paper in 1999 in Pacific Philosophical Quarterly. We live forwards, but understand backwards. He told the story of Mark Wilson, and the story goes the following way. Now, suppose that S is a member of an isolated community, the Druids, that inhabit an island in which the class of birds and the class of flying things are coextensive. Now, in that community, they use the term Ave to refer to things in these coextensive classes. And they all have beliefs, such as only Aves can fly, and Aves are living beings. Now, when S first sees a plane in the sky, she classifies it unproblematically as an Ave. And when she later sees one plane landed, she forms the belief that not all Aves are living things, living beings. And so the practice to apply Ave to planes catches on in the Druid community. And they all consider that with Ave, they have always referred to things that fly. And they recognize that some of the previous beliefs that they have about Aves, for instance, that they were living beings, were false. But now suppose that the story is slightly different. Suppose that S had first seen a plane on the ground, not realizing that it could fly. She might have classified it also unproblematically as a non-Ave. Might have said, that's not an Ave. And afterwards, had she seen it taking off, she would have concluded that not all things that fly are Aves. Now, supposing the practice to catch among the Druids, as and other Druids would also have thought that with Ave, they had always referred to birds, recognizing that some of the previous beliefs that they had about Aves, namely that only Aves could fly, were false. In either case, the Druids would understand their current use as naturally derived and naturally connected to their previous use. Now, this case by Mark Wilson has often been presented as a puzzle case for a principle that for a long time was taking as the default, or the interpretation of the principle was taken as the default. The strong interpretation of the principle that meaning determines extension, that was interpreted to mean that whenever you introduce a term in a language, and it becomes meaningful, the extension of the term is fixed once and for all. Now, it's a little bit puzzling that these nowadays practically nobody accepts this strong interpretation of the principle that meaning determines extension, but it used to be the pervasive assumption, which, when you think about it, it's a little bit surprising that any of the theories of reference that were in contention at the time, or continue to be, believed or took as default that strong interpretation of the principle that meaning determines extension. Because, for instance, take descriptivism. Imagine that a certain term T is associated with the description, the things that have properties P and Q. Now, when an exemplar that hasn't been observed before, or a sample, shows up and it has properties P and Q, but it also has property H, it's perhaps too much to expect that the description in and of itself will clearly determine whether H is or is not relevant for the classification of that thing, of that sample under T. Namely, whether the sample must be H or doesn't have to be H in order to be classified as such. So it seems that you could have this situation in which that the description associated with the term does not determine whether this new sample that has properties PQ, but also H, is going to be under the extension of T or not. And among other things, that may depend on issues, or will depend on issues that are not semantic at all. It's not constitutive of the description, whether or not that sample should be classified as a T. It may depend on, for instance, how important to us or how relevant to us and to our interests property H is. In a sense, it is even more striking that anti-descriptivists, those that follow the Kripke and Putnam approach, would feel such an allegiance to the strong interpretation of the principle that meaning determines extension, the once and for all interpretation. I know that Kripke and Putnam and Kripke's and Putnam's approach is often considered to be deeply committed to a form of essentialism, and of course, then if one associates essentialism to a certain term, or the criteria for application of a term depend on whether a sample has the essence, then of course the extension of the term T will be determined once and for all once the term T is introduced in the language. But we think, and we have defended it in a previous paper, one prior to the one in Synthes, it seems to us that even if Kripke and Putnam were themselves, at least Kripke, Putnam sort of, essentialists, one thing is whether essentialists, they were essentialists. Completely different thing is whether the approach is committed to essentialism. And we have defended that the approach in and of itself is not. In fact, there is something that is, people talk a lot about the commitment of Kripke and Putnam approach to essentialism, but there's something that is usually forgotten, and it's that the model, the Kripke-Putnam model, postulates that the classification of things or samples into kinds depends on the similarities to original paradigms. Now, since things are similar and dissimilar in many respects, it seems that it's too much to expect that the similarity or similarities that are responsible for classification be fixed for any term once and for all at the very moment of introduction of the term. So in any case, as I say, nowadays, people don't seem to follow this kind of strong interpretation of the principle that meaning determines extension. But Mark Wilson's example was precisely a puzzle case for that kind of model, for the model that the extension is determined once and for all. But now you may say, well, that's a nice example or a nice illustration, but it's, after all, it's a fictional case, right? It's a fictional case that we use to illustrate flexibility. The idea being that there seem to be open, different alternative paths to classify or fail to classify something under the extension of a certain term. And no matter which way we go, it seems that there is no break with past practice. Right? Now, this is a very interesting example. It's the case, it's what we use to illustrate that a term like ABI has a flexible semantics because it can go in more than one way. But are there any real life cases, or is this just only this fictional story? Well, Joseph Laporte has argued that the term water is a term of that kind, that the vernacular use of water originally had a lot of room. There was a lot of room for maneuvering and determining what water was going to apply to. In time, as science advanced and as scientists kept making decisions, those decisions precisified the meaning of water. And but there was this openness that slowly does not exist anymore. So there is a sense in which that precisification has been a process towards inflexibility, towards actually fixing the extension of water in a way in which there's very little room for maneuver now, in which about finding a sample of a new thing and being equally possible to classify it or not classify it as water. So in that sense, if Joseph Laporte's position is if the example that he gives us of water is an example of a term that had a flexible semantics, because there were several alternative possibilities. Henry Jackman calls them alternative equilibria that are consistent with past usage. If we understand this as a flexible semantics originally that keeps getting precisified, that process of precisification, which is a matter of decision by scientists, really looks very much, it seems to us, like a process of engineering, of conceptual engineering. The meaning gets precisified, the meaning gets engineered. However, it seems to us that not the flexibility moves, not all the cases in which there's a certain openness about which way to go when one thinks about including or not including something under the extension of a term, that they are not all clearly cases of precisification or refinement of the meaning, in which case we are not sure that those are cases, when there are those changes, when there are those moves, we're not sure if those are to be considered cases of engineering. For instance, one case that we think it's interesting to consider is the case of esports. Now, video game competitions are nowadays a social phenomenon. They bring together millions of players. They have become a business of great proportions. And there has been a discussion about whether those competitions should be considered sports competitions. In fact, since 2017, the International Olympic Committee has acknowledged that they could be considered a sporting activity. They highlight features just as the intensity of training, which is comparable to traditional sports. And in fact, there was even talk back when we wrote our paper about whether esports were going to be considered part of the Tokyo Games that had to occur in 2020. They didn't occur in 2020. We don't know what's going to happen in 2021. Eventually, the decision was that they would not be part of the Tokyo Games. That was partly because of business-like of a business-like decision, something that has absolutely nothing to do with the semantics of the word sports. Now, the decision has gone this way, but of course, the decision could have gone another way, right? They could have said, look, this is already considered a sports activity. Let's say that this is an Olympic sport also. Now, the question is, would adding esports to the extension of sport, definitely, and definitely the recognition as an Olympic sport would have been the final big recognition. Would adding esports to the extension of sports involve a refining or a precisification of the meaning of sport? Well, in a sense, it's tempting to say yes. That it does. After all, if we accept that the decision could go either way, aren't we implicitly accepting that before the decision, it is indeterminate whether they are sports or not sports? And in fact, a very common reaction among philosophers and non-philosophers alike is to express surprise that an activity such as playing video games can be considered a sport. But that we think is nothing to do with the semantics of the word sport. It has to do partly, we think, with something very much unsemantic, something that has to do with the role of stereotypes. Now, the stereotype of the typical video game player is not this one, is not these kids, you know, obviously doing a very interesting activity. I don't know if you had a chance to see on TV any of these competitions. I have suffered through some because of having young children, but it's certainly it's an amazing activity, and it's very difficult to say that this is not something that looks very much like a sport. But that's not the stereotype. The stereotype is a kid permanently dressed in pajamas, locked in the room all day and consuming cold pizza and Coca-Cola, and that does not invite an immediate connection to the stereotypical world of sports. At best, this is a good stereotype, a bunch of friends drinking and having pizza and playing video games. So it's difficult to connect video gaming with a sport. Yet, careful, because snooker and darts, which are also typical pub activities, do not invite such a connection to stereotypical games either, to stereotypical sports either. I'm afraid I need to apologize. I think that this is not a snooker table. This is a billiard balls table, I'm afraid. But anyway, I apologize to those of you in the United Kingdom that I didn't realize when I found the photo. Now, they are typical pub activities. They don't invite such a connection with the traditional stereotype of a sporting activity. Yet, snooker has been considered a sport for a long time. And in fact, it was a sport in the Paralympic Games from 1960 to 1988. And there are voices that are claiming the same destiny for darts. There is, if you want to follow this discussion, there's a very interesting page, webpage, rulesofsport.com, in which you will find all kinds of discussion about why these activities should be considered definitely sports. Now, it's worth noting that in those cases, the emergence of a sponsor, which is surely not a semantic matter, has an influence in making them be considered sports. Now, but the point is that if snooker and darts have already a claim at being sports, would the addition of video game competitions constitute a modification or processification of the meaning of sport? It doesn't seem very clear to us, in which case this is another one. This is a real life case in which you have something that is close to the Abbey case, in which the extension can be extended. The domain of application can be extended in a way or not extended. And there doesn't seem to be a change of criteria, a change of meaning. We think that this would be closer to the Abbey case than the case of water that Joe Laporte considers. Now, a case that clearly highlights the interplay between semantic flexibility and inflexibility involves the dispute around same-sex marriage. Now, among the supporters of same-sex marriage, the discussion has moved around two different lines, both of them inflexible. On the one hand, we find those that accept that traditional marriage involves the union of women and men. That's what marriage is. But they then declare that the traditional institution of marriage is defunct. And they see the acceptance of same-sex marriage as the dawn of a different institution, and therefore of a different concept of marriage, for which we may want to use the old word, but it's a completely different concept of marriage. The other, on the other hand, we find also those that accepting that those that that think like Adele Mercier, who acted as expert witness in Canadian courts, defending gay couples seeking the right to marry. She considers a semantic argument according to which the characteristic features that define a marriage, commitment to a life in common, respect, trust, etc., are present in heterosexual as well as in same-sex union, in which case same-sex marriage would have always been under the extension of marriage, right? They're both inflexible but in different ways. Epstein, because he considers that it's part of the meaning of marriage, that it's between man and woman. He's quite happy to do away with marriage in that sense, and he thinks that we need to create an institution. Mercier, because she thinks that it's always been, same-sex marriage has always been under the extension, and in fact, the failure is not to recognize it as such. But now, there would be also a different strategy. Namely, another way of looking at the issue would be to consider marriage as a term with a flexible semantics, in which case, adapting Jackman's terminology, we would say that there are different alternative equilibria, different ways in which the decision can go, both of them compatible with the usage of the term. Now, returning to Avi and to all these cases and the relation between flexibility and engineering, some cases in which you have a flexible semantics and you have different moves, they don't seem to involve an active, intentional, purposeful process of revision or amelioration. And they don't seem to involve either a change in the criteria of application. Remember that in the Avi case, and also in the Esports case, the argument is that it's not entirely clear that there is a change in the criteria of application here. So are these cases of engineering? That's what we don't know. Insofar as engineering, conceptual engineering, is an activity with a purpose, with the explicit intention to make certain changes, then those cases in which the flexibility of the semantics of the term is being exploited would not be cases of engineering. Some of them would, but not all of them. And insofar as the process requires some change in the concept itself or in the meaning itself, it's not clear that those cases in which arguably there's not a change in the meaning, in spite of the fact that there being room to go into different directions, it's not clear that they would be cases of engineering. All right, the other distinction, tolerance. Tolerance, excuse me, let me do something up here. Okay. Tolerance has to do with the acceptability of different uses of a given term that divide roughly the same domain of application in different ways. Now, one case in which we can see that there is tolerance is with the use of fruit. There is a botanical use of the word fruit in which tomatoes are under the extension of the term fruit. But there is also a recognized culinary and commercial use of the word fruit in which tomatoes are not under the extension of the word fruit. In fact, when you go to a supermarket, tomatoes are not next to the bins of fruits. If you try to use your coupon to buy fruit, you try to use that coupon to buy tomatoes, they will tell you that you can't use it. Even if you ask your best botanist friend whether she puts fruit in her salad, she will not tell you, of course I put fruit in my salad, they put tomatoes. she probably will understand perfectly well that you're asking whether she puts berries and pears and apples and these kinds of things. So there are those two different uses. In fact, and that's even recognized by the Supreme Court of the United States for a case that I think is known by everybody that went all the way to the Supreme Court, because a group of people that didn't want to pay certain tax on tomatoes, claiming that tomatoes were fruit and fruits were in general exempt from that tax, actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ended up making them pay the tax, recognizing that the culinary use of fruit does not include tomatoes. So that's a case in which you have a case of tolerance, the acceptability of different uses. We think that there is an example of a case of strictness, a case of, if you wish, intolerance, is the case of death. Now, we don't think that in our community, we accept different uses of the word death, according to which this person is dead in this sense, ergo you can dispose from their body, but not dead in this other sense. And why, oops, now you disposed of the body, so now what we do? We don't think that, we think that there is a clear case of strictness. There is, let me see. Michael Moore, in this article, A Natural Law Theory of Interpretation, he wrote the following. He said, both we and our ancestors intended to refer to the thing, the naturally occurring event that death is. If they, our ancestors, knew what we know about revivability, they would also say that such persons are not dead. They would say this because they, like we, intended to refer to a thing whose nature is partially known. And they, like we, would change the conventional indicators of when someone is dead whenever a better scientific theory comes along. Now, sometimes when we have presented this case, we are told, well, look, I mean, death, there surely is a tolerant, it's a term with a tolerant semantics, with tolerant uses, because don't we accept death and brain death, and we distinguish it from clinically death? Well, I don't think that those are cases of tolerance. I think that those are cases in which there is discussion about what is exactly the best way of applying the term death. And I think that they are not cases of tolerance because of our interest in the topic. I mean, we really, when it comes to oneself and having someone saying this person is dead, you can cremate you can cremate this body. I mean, we really want to be dead, okay? And so we think that that's a case of definite intolerance. All right. An interesting case is the case of fish. There used to be a time in which fish was applied to all creatures of the sea, among them cetaceans. And for a while, but for a little while, there was a cohabitation of two different uses of the word fish. When Linnaeus came up with his taxonomy, scientists did not classify cetaceans, whales, dolphins, so on as fish, but the common public used to classify it as classify whales as fish. And in fact, that's another case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And there was a lot of discussion about it because the jury used the layperson conception of fish, which produced hilarity in the United Kingdom and among the people who already knew a little bit about taxonomy. We have, in case you're interested, we have this paper in which we explore and discuss this case on whales and fish to models of interpretation. It came out last year in jurisprudence. All right, I hope that it's clear that flexibility is different from tolerance. Flexibility, as I say, has to do with the having these possible ways of going that are consistent with past practice. Tolerance has to do with having accepted more than one use for a term in a community. You can have a case of tolerance in which you have two uses of a term in a community, and both uses may be inflexible. And they may not accept, they may be extremely well defined. That's a possibility. Now, how about tolerance and engineering? Well, actually, the acceptability of the coexistence of different uses may change over time, and it may change due to all kinds of factors. And some of those changes, when, for instance, there are two uses of a term in a community, one of them gets dropped, or vice versa, there is one use of a term in a community and then another one becomes acceptable and they cohabitate. So all this can happen due to all kinds of factors, social, contingent, accidental. And now, some of those changes may be the product of engineering, but some of those changes, we think, just may happen. They are not part of a purposeful activity. And insofar as conceptual engineering is conceived as an activity with the purpose of making certain kinds of changes in the meaning or in the use of expressions, we don't know if the latter kind of cases, those that happen just by accident, are conceivable as changes brought about by engineering. So there's another question again. All right, so the second part, we're going to try now to bring all this discussion, flexibility, tolerance, and their connection to engineering, to the case of a term, the term violence, which, as I say, this is a case that has legal implications. There's clearly, we think, tolerance in the use of violence. There's an everyday use of violence, where you can use violence definitely to speak about a physical aggression, physical attack. But sometimes it's very normal to talk about two people that were arguing, and this person started raising their voice and started insulting the other person, and they became very violent. And we understand perfectly well that doesn't mean that they were hitting one another. So there is this kind of tolerant use, which is a little open. But then also there is an expert use, and there's probably more than one expert use, but the kind of expert use that we're interested in is the legal use of violence. And we're going to be focusing on the Spanish Penal Code, the Criminal Code of 1995, although we know that these discussions that we are going to refer to today are also very common nowadays, at least in Germany. Now, in the Spanish Penal Code of 1995, violence is strictly physical attack or assault, because the code distinguishes violence, which is something that perpetrated against people, intimidation, also something perpetrated against people, and use of force, which is perpetrated against, if you want, things like if you commit a robbery and you break a window or something of that nature, that's use of force, right? The first two, violence and intimidation, are directed to people. The other one is directed to things. But the code distinguishes violence, clearly violence, from intimidation. Now, these three concepts are used to establish different sentencing levels for each in the crimes in which they figure as concepts, but also, and that's the part that perhaps we're going to be more interested in, they're used to typify different kinds of crimes. Namely, there are crimes that are characterized as crimes that involve or require violence, crimes that involve or require intimidation, so forth and so on. So the distinction is present in the articles on sexual assault, article number 172, that distinguishes violence and intimidation, and robbery, article number 237. It distinguishes the three. But now something interesting happens, and that's the article on coercion, article number 172. The article on coercion uses only the term violence. And I have put the article here, which is the article tells you what the sentencing is going to be like. And I've put it in Spanish because I confess to be incapable of translating Spanish legalese into anything minimally comprehensible. But the interesting idea is this one. What it says is that it's talking about someone who, without being legitimately authorized, prevents another person with violence from doing something not prohibited by law or compels them to do something they do not want to do. And then it gives the sentencing 6 months or 3 years, so forth and so on. All right, so this article only uses the term violence. So observe, if there's only intimidation without a physical attack or assault, there's no crime of coercion. And that immediately you can see why this is in some sense problematic, because there are cases that are clear. They seem clear cases of coercion, and there's no physical assault. There is manipulation, there's intimidation. So people like me, who am a lay person, I tell Lorena, okay, that's perfect, but how about including intimidation alongside violence in Article 172 on crimes of coercion? And then, of course, Lorena looks at me and says, look, changing the penal code involves an extremely complex process. It has to be approved by Parliament. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult in Spain nowadays we have a parliament that refuses to agree on anything, even if it's a matter of survival of the country. And so it's often easier to keep a term and reinterpret it somehow. So what has happened with the crimes of coercion? Violence has been interpreted to include more things than just physical violence. It just seems like one good thing to do. And so the interpretation that the Spanish Supreme Court does appeals to something that they call the spiritualization of violence. So 3 examples of 3 sentences that, or 3 decisions under Article 172, which is the article on coercion. The first one from November, a decision of the Supreme Court in November 1989, which was the case of a person that fainted to run someone over with a car. The person accelerated and then it stopped very suddenly. As a result, the other person had sustained harms, so on. Now, these would seem rather, or the people who argued about how this was being interpreted argued that probably intimidation was being interpreted as a form of violence. Because of course, I mean, if it's a coercion, it has to have violence. There's no other way around it. That's what the penal code says. A second case, quite surprising, in 1983, another crime that was considered a crime of coercion was cutting the water supply to people that had not paid a specific tax, which is that was ordered by the mayor of a town, and that was considered to be coercion, possibly use of force. Not entirely clear what it was. There has been finally a recent decision by the Supreme Court from July 2020, in which the leading data on the cloud pertaining to an ex-partner has been considered under the crime of coercion, under Article 172. And in this case, the Supreme Court has not even made any argument to present the crime as a form of violence. So observe that what is happening here, and that has to be very clear, is because the article on coercion speaks about violence. There's no way of classifying these 3, 1, 2, and 3, as a form of coercion, as a form of non-violent coercion. The only way to classify them as coercion is if they are considered forms of violence. Another case that is interesting is a decision that was not made under the article of coercion, but it may be pointing the way of the future. There was a sentence under Article 227, that is the article on the failure to pay pension or alimony to an ex-partner. Now, the court's argument mentions the failure as a form of economic violence. So, although, as I say, this was not characterized as a crime of coercion, the very talk about economic violence makes you wonder whether it could eventually be argued that the crime in question falls under Article 172, the article on coercion, since the perpetrator of the offense prevents another person with violence, economic violence, from doing something not prohibited by law or compels them to do something they do not want to do. If you want to see a little more of the discussion, it's all in Spanish, but it's very interesting, and here is the link. So observe that something that is happening is that the extension of the expert term violence that started in the Penal Civil Code of 1995 being exclusively physical violence is the extension is changing. So the term is being treated as having a flexible kind of semantics. Now, an alleged advantage of the flexibilization relies on the fact that the use of the term is tolerant. That's something that, can be pointed out, namely the fact that an everyday use and an expert use coexist. Because some people have argued that, look, the legal expert use is being brought closer to the everyday use. And that has been seen by some people as an advantage. Observe that this is a mirror image of the fish case. In the fish case, you had tolerant, two different uses, and all of a sudden one of the uses disappears, and there is a kind of convergence towards the scientific use. Here you have the legal or expert use converging towards the more everyday use, so to speak. Now, from the point of view of the lay person, the result of all these decisions may be very welcome, because of course you think, look, all these people were coercing other people. That looks right, and they deserve those strong sentences. Now, it may be, and in fact, in some cases, there have been arguments praising this kind of extension of the domain of application of the word violence. But here is a concern. We think that it may have harmful consequences. What kinds of harmful consequences? Well, the concern comes from two different places. First, it may have harmful consequences regards what it is that counts as legitimate use of violence by police. This is a long discussion. I mean, police are given by society the privilege of using violence when this is needed. As I said, this, but there is another one in which that it may be more in the horizon, but that we think that there are reasons to be concerned, and that has to do with the protection of a vulnerable party in cases of abuse or mistreatment. So this is an image from CNN, and as you can see, there are people sitting, and the police use their batons. The police needed to reach a building, and the sentence, the decision by the judges mentions the fact that the police were prevented from doing their job that was judicially mandated by people who were actively practicing passive resistance. And that therefore the use of the batons and hitting them and so on was entirely justified. So there are issues here as to whether certain attitudes, imagine that perhaps these people, who knows, maybe they were insulting the police, maybe they were looking at them with bad faces. There are questions here as to whether an excessive extension of the notion of the domain of application of the notion of violence may make certain acts by the police, certain behaviors by police, more justifiable as a kind of a legitimate use of violence. But let me go to the other one. And of course, I mean, maybe the people, this is from The Guardian, maybe the people who were demonstrating in front of the White House, maybe they were out of the fences, maybe they were doing something illegal, but there is a question as to whether what they were doing could be characterized, maybe they were insulting the police. What they were doing could be characterized, if what they were doing can be characterized as violence, then probably using tear gas is entirely justified, so that Mr. Trump can go and make his photo with a Bible that many people have pointed out that he was holding it upside down. Now, the other case is the case in which the protection of a vulnerable party in cases of mistreatment. This is a campaign by, the source of this is Amnesty International. And so what is happening here is that if things that may be considered intimidation, things like humiliating, insulting, manipulating, causing fear, demeaning, if all these things can be considered violence, there is a question about whether when a man hits a woman, whether it can be argued that she imagine that these people are in a fight, and the fight gets completely out of control. There are terrible words, there are insults, there is perhaps years of manipulation, insult, humiliation, demeaning. The question is whether hitting another person could at some point be characterized as practically almost as an act of self-defense, as responding to violence, right? And in fact, believe it or not, this is a defense that has already been tried. It hasn't been successful in the courts, but it has been tried. There is, I've left it here in Spanish, but there is this webpage by a group of lawyers in which they talk about the fact that men are mistreated. I mean, that women are not just the recipients of mistreatment. And what they mean is that men are mistreated psychologically. And it's very funny here, they say, I don't know if they know what they're doing, but they say in that kind of mistreatment, the woman occupies a position that is much superior to the man, something that is logical, given that women are much more intelligent than men, and consequently, they have more resources when it comes to mistreating the man. But here there is a problem, right? If violence gets so extended, if feigning to a case of that you're going to run over a person, if cutting the water of supply is a form of violence, if not paying the pension ends up becoming also a form of violence, there is a question here as to whether something like this may blow up in our faces, that the violence in cases of that violence against women may be seen as a reaction to another form of violence. Now, of course, even in those cases, one could say, look, it would come down to proportionality. One thing is to insult, to demean, to look with a hateful eyes at someone else, and a different thing is to hit them. But proportionality is very different from saying, look, I mean, you hit this person, you hit this woman, you committed a crime, she did not. And so we are thinking that there may be issues here that need to be considered. And now a more abstract and more subtle detrimental result, but that's something that I just wanted to mention in case you're interested, but that's something that Lorena particularly is very interested in, is the fact that the judges interpret so much and they extend the application of terms in so many creative ways, it's just blurring the difference between the legislative branch and the judicial one. And it's making the legislator practically frozen, not making there's no need to make new laws because the law is already being reinterpreted in ways that the judges consider correct. So just to finish, we have done here two things. First, we had talked about flexibility and tolerance, that are two different phenomena about the use of terms. And we have discussed the connection or lack of connection with conceptual engineering. And we have used also the discussion about flexibility and tolerance we have applied it to the case of violence. Now, questions open on violence, on the term violence and engineering. Now, the questions have to do with the change, whether the change in the domain of application of violence, whether it's a case of continuity of use like AVI or esports, or does it involve a clear change in meaning? In either case, can it be seen, is it an instance, a case of conceptual engineering? And also, the question is that what are its social and political benefits and costs? If it's a case of engineering, is here a case like a failure of the engineering and the engineering process? So these are open questions that, as I say, we're not entirely clear about. And so it would be a good thing for us to know what you think about all this. Thank you.